At the end of every MotoGP race, the top 3 riders are singled out for their achievement, and they earn the right to stand on the coveted podium. But how did this tradition start? Well, apparently the first major competition to use a podium was the 1930 British Empire Games, now known as the Commonwealth Games, but the history of awarding the top 3 athletes goes further back. Regardless of how, when, or why it started, podiums are still used over a century later. And in the world of motorsports, and as an extension MotoGP, short of a Grand Prix win, a podium is the next best thing. What makes the podium somewhat unique in motorsports is that it's one of the only achievements that's shared among multiple competitors in a weekend. 2 riders can't win the same race, but 2 of them can share the same podium, and then after that one of them might go on to share a podium with a different rider the next time out, and so on and so forth until a chain forms between these riders who shared podiums together. What if you mapped out all of those connections? Well, it would look something like this. Actually, it would look exactly like this. That's what this is. This is every MotoGP podium mapped out. So let's take a tour. At its most basic, each dot, or node, represents a rider. The bigger the node, the more podiums they scored. The nodes are connected through lines. Each line between the nodes represents a shared podium. The thicker the connection, the more podiums those 2 riders shared. Let's take a look at an example. Here's Kenny Roberts, 3-time world champion for Yamaha and one of the most influential riders ever. In short, he was really good. 39 podiums during his relatively short career. He has quite a few connections as well, 18 of them. As we can see, a lot of them are just 1 or 2 shared podiums, like his 1980 Nations Grand Prix podium with Graziano Rossi. But there are some pretty strong connections here as well. These are mostly with riders who he fought for championships with, sharing podiums with them across a season or multiple seasons. His strongest connections are with British superstar Barry Sheene and fellow American rider Randy Mamola. He shared 12 podiums with each of them. We tend to discuss MotoGP in terms of disconnected eras, different periods of time where riders were competing on different types of machines. But here we can see that almost every single rider exists in a connected web of history. You can trace a path from almost any rider to almost any other. So why don't we give it a shot? What is the shortest path from the very first podium to the most recent? Well, the first podium was at the Isle of Man TT in 1949, and it consisted of Harold Daniel, Johnny Lockett, and Ernie Lyons. At the time of recording, the most recent podium consisted of Marco Bezzecchi, Jorge Martin, and Fabio Di Gianantonio at the Grand Prix of Americas in 2026. There have probably been more recent podiums by the time this video comes out, but frankly, it probably won't change the result all that much. We're going to start our journey through MotoGP history with the rider who came second in the very first race, Johnny Lockett. He would share a few podiums throughout his career with 4-time world champion Jeff Duke. In the final year of his career, Duke would share the 1959 French Grand Prix podium with Rhodesian rider Gary Hawking. Hawking would go on to win the 1961 World Championship in dominant fashion, but he would quit Grand Prix motorcycle racing after a single race in 1962. However, during that single race, he shared the senior TT podium with British rider Fred Stevens. Stevens only had 5 podiums in his career, and the next one was one he would share with one of the sport's most legendary privateers, Jack Findlay. Findlay connects with a wide variety of riders because he had a 2-decade-long career, and our next connection comes 16 years later, at the 1976 Swedish Grand Prix, where he finished runner-up to Barry Sheene. The British superstar would share a single podium with Eddie Lawson in 1984, and Steady Eddie will take us all the way through to the 90s, where Lawson would share a podium with another American rider, John Kaczynski, at the 1991 Italian Grand Prix, and Kaczynski would link up with Brazilian star Alex Barros in 1993 in Laguna Seca. 14 years later, in the final year of his career, Barros secured his last podium, which he shared with Dani Pedrosa. Pedrosa would go on to be one of the most prolific podium finishers of all time, and he would share 2 podiums with Maverick Vinales a decade later. Maverick Vinales would go on to share multiple podiums with Jorge Martin, the first of them being in 2023. And of course, Jorge Martin finished second place at the Grand Prix of the Americas. 12 riders, 11 connections, spanning 77 years of Grand Prix podiums. You can make connections just like these ones across the entire graph, connecting almost any riders you want through this web of shared rostrum appearances. I think it's pretty damn cool. But which riders have had the biggest impact? Well, the biggest node on the graph is Valentino Rossi. With 199 podiums, he has by far the most in Premier Class history. These nodes are obviously not to scale. If they were, Rossi would dwarf the vast majority of all other riders. The rest of the top 4 are also very close to Rossi. Marc Marquez is in second, followed by Jorge Lorenzo and Dani Pedrosa. Unsurprisingly, having the most successful riders by number of podiums racing in the same era does mean that the strongest connections are here as well. Far and away the pair of riders with the most shared podiums is Lorenzo and Pedrosa, who shared a whopping 63 podiums across their MotoGP careers. Lorenzo also shared 53 podiums with Valentino Rossi, and unsurprisingly in third are Rossi and Pedrosa, having shared 44 podiums. The fourth strongest connection brings in another major player. It's Pedrosa again, but this time he's sharing the stage with Australian phenom Casey Stoner, who ranks 8th among total podiums. And finally, tied for the 5th most shared podiums is Marc Marquez and Valentino Rossi. Using these connections between riders, we can actually see rivalries between the dominant riders of each era. Obviously, the Alien Quartet and Marc Marquez dominated the 2000s and 2010s, but across the chart we can see rivalries like Eddie Lawson and Wayne Gardner, or Wayne Rainey and Kevin Schwantz. Both of them also had 34 shared podiums, as did Max Biaggi and Valentino Rossi early in the 2000s. This can tell us a lot about the era that these riders dominated. The 2000s and 2010s saw a few riders monopolizing the podium market. That means that naturally these alien talents have more podiums than anyone else and more shared podiums than anyone else. And it's not just here that we can see the effects of MotoGP history. While this chart does connect MotoGP history together, the different parts of this chart can tell us a lot about the different eras of the sport as well. So far, I haven't talked about what the different colors represent. Each color represents a different modularity class. But that is boring nerd shit and you don't want to know about it. All that matters is that these modularity classes represent groups of riders that are heavily connected. Nodes that are the same color are closer together and more connected than nodes of different colors. And because of that, the different colors do a really good job of separating the different eras of the sport. Something I haven't mentioned is that the network exists in roughly chronological order. Starting at about 10 o'clock in the top left, we have the very first MotoGP podium. And going around counterclockwise, we move forward in time until we wrap all the way around to the present day. It's fascinating to me how well the eras are divided here. I did not color these nodes manually. I simply assigned a color to each modularity class that was defined using the formula. And the network still splits the championship into the eras that fans have often defined for years solely based on who shared podiums with each other mathematically. It's quantitative evidence of the shifts in the sport that fans have felt over decades. And the way the network looks and changes from era to era reflects the nature of each period of MotoGP history. Let's take a closer look. Way out here, these are the riders of the earliest days of the World Championship, the 1950s. Your Jeff Dukes, Umberto Massettis, and John Surteeses. This was an era dominated by factory riders, with some privateers on their bikes dotting the outside with an occasional podium. The very early days saw pre-war riders at the end of their careers securing some podiums, before riders like Umberto Massetti and Jeff Duke would start their careers and begin to dominate. Duke is at the very center of this era. The most podiums of anyone with 32, and connections with almost every other podium finisher. At the end of this era, we find John Surtees. He had less podiums than Duke, but does a great job to bridge the gap between this era and the next one. Moving counterclockwise, we get to the yellow section, and these are the riders of the 1960s and early 70s, the era of MV Agusta domination and privateer bikes. This is far and away the most widespread era on this graph, and in my opinion the most interesting. You have a couple of riders who dominated. Mike Hailwood and Giacomo Agostini are the major hubs of this era. Hailwood with 48 podiums and Agostini with 88. These two were MV Agusta factory riders during an era where most of the time there were no other serious contenders. They were able to monopolize wins. But this also meant that there was a lot of parity and rotation among the privateers at the time. And there are more riders here with 1 or 2 podiums on the fringes of the chart than anywhere else. Look at how many tiny dots are around the perimeter of this area. Frequently, there will be pairs connected only to each other. Podiums where 2 riders got the only one of their career and shared it with a regular podium finisher deeper within the network. Frequently, Hailwood or Agostini. Agostini is the most connected rider on this graph. Even with over twice as many podiums as Agostini, Valentino Rossi only shared the podium with 38 riders during his career. That is a very impressive figure. It's the second most of any rider, and it's incredibly high given how many shared podiums he had with other dominant riders of his era. Even despite that, Agostini nearly doubles this figure. He has a whopping 69 different connections with other riders. He shared the stage with more riders than anyone else ever has, and probably ever will again. Before we move on from this era, I want to point out another pattern that I find really neat. This cluster down here. This is what I like to call Little Argentina. The Argentine Grand Prix was the first one ever held outside Europe in 1961, and for 3 years it was the final or penultimate round of the season. In all 3 of those seasons, the Premier Class title had already been decided. In a time where riders and teams weren't required to appear at every round, factory teams didn't want to pay the high travel costs to go outside of Europe, and privateers often couldn't afford it. This meant local riders had a chance to dominate, and that includes these 4. Jorge Kisling, Benedito Caldereya, and the first brothers to ever share a Premier Class podium, Juan Carlos and Eduardo Salatino. It's little pockets like this that can show interesting facets of MotoGP history, and how they connect to everything else. The light orange section represents the late 1970s and early 1980s, the dawn of the two-stroke era and most of the American domination of the sport. Immediately, this looks more like the 1950s than the prior era. Less small outliers and more of a consistent group of riders dominating, especially once you get deeper into the 80s. With more and more races on the calendar, these riders were sharing more podium, and we can start to see some more prominent connections. Most notably, Eddie Lawson and Wayne Gardner, who share 34 podiums, tied for 5th most. The lines between the 1980s and the dark orange of the 1990s are less defined than in previous eras, and part of me was a little surprised that the 1990s got their own defined era on this list, but it does kind of make sense. The 90s represent the end of American domination and the end of the two-stroke era. While there were a few dominant riders, most notably Wayne Rainey, Kevin Schwantz, and Mick Doohan, who were also active during the 80s and shared a lot of podiums with several riders in that era, most of the other podium finishers represented a full changing cast from the 1980s. The way the sport was being viewed and the way that riders were starting to come up through the ranks was different, and it showed. However, despite the changing casts, the 90s do look pretty similar to the 80s. Privateers were now facing extinction at the hands of rising costs of travel and machinery, and the lines are becoming even thicker as the factory riders are again able to dominate, again with a longer schedule than ever. One really interesting connection is out here on the right. This is the connection shared by Pier Francesco Chili, Simon Buckmaster, and Michael Rudroff. Buckmaster and Rudroff each only had 1 podium, secured at the 1989 Nations Grand Prix. This race was the site of a rider's boycott due to track conditions, and all of the top riders sat out of the race, with the exception of Killy, the hometown rider who was threatened with consequences if he didn't ride. He won the race without difficulty, all while facing jeers from his fellow riders from the sidelines. Reportedly, after the race, he was racked with guilt. However, it's only because he took to the track that Buckmaster and Rudroff are connected to the rest of the graph at all. If Killy hadn't raced and Marco Gentile had finished on the podium instead of in 4th, the 3 of them would be floating off the edge of the graph, alone and disconnected from the rest of history. Let's move on to the next era, the light red 2000s and 2010s. Covering twice as much time as the last 2 eras, we've already discussed what makes this era look the way it does. It's the sustained dominance of Rossi, Pedrosa, Lorenzo, Stoner, and Marquez. The biggest nodes and thickest connections on the map are all here, and the borders between this era and the ones before it and after it are more entangled than ever. And finally, we reach the modern day, the dark red at the top of the network. Marc Marquez, while grouped with the 2000s and 2010s, sits comfortably within the bounds of this era as well. And we can see that pretty notably, there are less thick connections than in the past few eras. Instead, a massive entanglement of small connections forms a spiderweb throughout the 2020s. While this era has been dominated by Ducati so far, in terms of riders, there's been a solid amount of parity. Almost every rider on the grid today has podiums, and they're almost all connected with each other. There are very few small nodes here, and a lot of the small nodes are riders who are considered to be on the rise right now, like Raul Fernandez. More riders have been able to find more success and share podiums with more faces than ever here. And that's how almost every node fits in. Almost. You've probably noticed them by now. A few small clusters floating around the perimeter, disconnected from the main body of the network. All alone. How did these come about? The answer is simple on the surface. These are single races where every rider on the podium never stepped on another podium before or after. This has happened 4 times, leading to 4 isolated smaller groups within the network. As you can probably imagine, each one of these has a story behind it, and they're worth taking a look at individually. First was the 1974 German Grand Prix. This event was boycotted by factory riders, leading to a German podium lockout. Edmund Chihak, Helmut Kastner, and Walter Kalech would never step on a podium again. Later that same year came the Isle of Man. an event which was already being boycotted by many riders on the grid. However, this is the only one to produce a truly independent podium. Consisting of Phil Carpenter, Charlie Williams, and Tony Rudder, they would form the second unconnected group on our grid. It would be another 5 years before the next unconnected podium. A poor resurfacing job at Spa in 1979 saw factory riders again refuse to ride, leading to our third separated group. Dennis Ireland, Kenny Blake, and Gary Lingham took their only podiums that day. Lingham and Blake wouldn't finish any other races that year, and both of them would actually fail to qualify for the final round of that season. In 1982, another boycott would occur in France. Michel Frucci, Frank Gross, and Steve Parrish would become the last trio unconnected to date. Frucci's win also represents the only win for Italian factory San Venero, which is a shame because that is a damn good looking bike. And finally, that is how every node fits into MotoGP history. But which ones are the most important? In order to answer that, we have to understand what makes a node important in a network like this. It's something called betweenness centrality. Get that formula off the screen, they do not care. If the point of this network is to connect different riders together, betweenness measures how often a node shows up when you try and connect any two riders together. In any attempt to connect two riders, these nodes are the most frequent stops along the way. In our case, these tend to be successful riders who bridge the gap between eras. Giacomo Agostini sits in third, hugely influenced by his massive number of total connections. Eddie Lawson sits in second, with connections to riders from the 1970s and 1990s, as well as being wildly consistent throughout the 1980s. He finds himself as one of the most important connectors on the graph. But not the most important. That honor goes to someone we've talked about already, Barry Sheene. Sheene was the first major star of the two-stroke era, and his connections to a very limited pool of podium finishers around that time bridged the gap between the 4-stroke 500s and 2-stroke 500s. He is almost a requirement to find the shortest path between riders from before and after the mid-70s. Finally, let me just talk about John Hartle, because not enough people do. Hartle was wildly consistent across a long career. He raced from 1955 to 1968, with podiums almost every year. He would finish runner-up in the 500cc championship in 1958, and would finish third in the championship a whopping 4 times, more than any other rider ever has. In this network, he fulfills a similar role to Sheene in the 70s, but for the 50s and 60s. His long career and having shared podiums with stars from the 50s, 60s, and even 70s make him the 6th most important node in this entire network. But if we can find the most important rider, we can also find the single most important podium. By looking at just connections where riders only shared a single podium, and then measuring the importance of each of those connections, we can figure out which single podium helps connect the most riders together. Naturally, it's the podium shared by the 2 most important riders. The only podium connecting Barry Sheene and Eddie Lawson, the 1984 South African Grand Prix. It was the first race of Sheene's final season. He had qualified 7th, but racing on a horsepower track with a semi-works bike, he wasn't a favorite. Then the rain began to pour. Lawson pulled away quickly. Sheene didn't. He was outside the top 10, but Sheene settled in and put his head down. And by the end of the race, he climbed to 3rd place, 20 seconds ahead of 4th place Didier de Rodriguez. He and Lawson shared their only podium together. It's the single most important podium in this entire network. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to share a couple of other things I found out. I was curious about who had the most podiums with the fewest people. It turns out that's Jorge Lorenzo. He had 114 podiums, which he only shared with 18 riders. This gives him a ratio of 6.33, meaning he only gained a new podium connection around every 6 podiums. That's pretty far and away the most of anyone. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the top 5 is Pedrosa, Rossi, Stoner, and Marquez. These are all riders in the top 10 for total podiums, but they shared so many among themselves that it doesn't really matter. What's more interesting is the opposite end. Who made the most new connections in the fewest amount of podiums? Well, the lowest this ratio can go is 0.5. This would mean that a rider never shared a podium with the same rider twice. Every time they stood on the podium, it was brand new faces. As you can imagine, this happened a lot. Every rider with only 1 podium has a ratio of 0.5. Some riders got there with 2 podiums, a few even did it with 3. However, a single rider managed to get 5 podiums and 10 connections. That rider was Pierre Monneray. At France in 1954, Belgium in 1955, and Belgium, Germany, and the Nations Grand Prix in 1956, Monneray secured 5 podiums, and did so while sharing the stage with different riders every single time out. Absolutely incredible. Does this really matter? Who knows? I love the history of MotoGP, and I love seeing how it's evolved over time and connecting riders back through the eras. I love looking at this network. I have looked at it for hours, just looking at different riders and who they've been connected to throughout history. I find it absolutely fascinating. And if you've stuck around for this long, thank you for finding it interesting too. Hitting like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Finally, a special thank you to A-Dumb. He's made a few of these network videos, and his video about the network of MLB home runs was a huge inspiration for this one. I didn't use any of his code or anything for this video, but I did somewhat format my network the same as his. Thank you all very much for watching. And a special thank you to my channel members. MVP2112, Venturian CRO, Sean, Motosapien, B, Jack the world's fastest Maori, Drew Gibbs, Really Very Bored 1, Carl Ruppersberg, Friday 42, Money Penny, Luis Campos, ASX91, Ian Allison, Derek Briganti, and Silver Harbor Spotlight. Thank you all so much for continuing to support the channel, even though it's been forever since I last made a video. To everyone, I'm sorry it's been so long since I last made a video. Life has just been very busy recently. I am hoping to get more stuff out soon. Thank you for watching, and have a fantastic day.